Wondering why you're losing corals either rapidly with many corals at once, or sometimes even more frustrating, slowly and one at a time? Periodic but consistent mortalities or stressed out brown corals? Poor water chemistry is a very common cause, but more specifically, tank pollutants. Today we put an end to that and solve all those challenges. Hey, this is Ryan with BRStv's Master Reef Tank Chemistry mini-series, Set It and Forget It Solutions for getting chemistry right the first time. This is episode 2 with a focus on tank pollutants, clear guidance on the source of common pollutants in our tanks, what to look out for with each, methods of dealing with them in a manner where they're no longer a barrier to your success, mastering pollutants being the thing that often transitions a 1-year tank to 3 to 4, and avoiding many of the most common long-term challenges with reef tanks. We're going to share a lot today, and I'm certain most of you will look at tank pollutants and chemistry in an entirely different way by the end of today's episode. But if all you want to know is how to solve these challenges, I can share that in less than 30 seconds. A small amount of carbon to combat unintended chemicals, organic pollutants and buildup of color pigments, RODI water to combat pollutants in city and well water, a simple, clean additive system in salt mix, a skimmer or filter pad socks and sheets to combat food and related waste additions. Then, a consistent water change schedule will neutralize all kinds of effects of bad decisions, bad luck, and even less than perfect filtration in other areas. However, that's just the how. Knowing the finer details as to the why that approach works is the evolutionary step in mastering any topic. In that spirit, we're going to share 3 things today. Some different types of pollutants, which are either considered inert, generally safe, or just straight up poison. Second, the actual sources of most contaminants and clarity of what a reactive versus proactive approach to all this will achieve. I'm fairly certain most of you are going to appreciate the path of dealing with this before it's a problem rather than treating it after. To start this all off, if there's only one thing you hear today, let it be this. The most common source of pollutant-related issues is not a single misstep or input of massive amount of toxins. Way more commonly, it's a result of prolonged missteps that come from not fully understanding what's going in the tank eventually needs to come out. Without an export method, 300 daily doses of something considered generally safe at low levels often lands you in the exact same place as dosing all 300 doses at once, where it would likely be considered a poison. This is so important and so frequently overlooked that I'll say it again, without an export method, 300 daily doses of something that's considered generally safe may actually be toxic as it builds up over time and may lead to the same path as a single poisonous dose. The conundrum here is when we run into issues with a tank, we all look at what we've done recently. Very few of us seriously consider something that we've been doing or using daily for a year as the cause of the current issue. In fact, the natural response is to defend the things that we've been doing that long as a direct cause of success, and very little to no room to consider them as a source of an issue. I've said it, you've said it, I've seen it shared 20 times a day. This thing is safe or not the cause of my issue because I've used it for a year or more without issue, often without much thought about how that dose may have actually increased over the year, or compensating export methods may have changed during that time. You're going to see today some surprising sources of things you may have considered 100% safe before, but maybe aren't. It's been my experience that 90% of the pollutant-related mortalities or issues in the tank are not related to something that we did yesterday, but the direct results of decisions we made months to a year ago and the cumulative effects of not understanding the input so we can manage the export. Something that's absolutely solvable. The most important concept today is likely the difference between what I'll call poisons, the inerts, and generally safe contaminants at reasonable levels. Poisons meaning I put it in the tank and the fish and corals immediately started dying. You have hours to days to solve before total crash. Ammonia, copper, and disinfectants are common examples, but issues related to straight up poisons are fairly uncommon and frequently misdiagnosed. There are not many things that we can put in the tank that have the potential to be that toxic, particularly with brands or solutions which have proven themselves worthy of the community's trust. Then the totally inert contaminants, meaning at any reasonable level, there'll be absolutely no impact from these pollutants. The excess sodium and chloride from most 2 parts are a pretty decent example. These would have to be grossly mismanaged to harm the tank. But like poisons, the completely inerts are also pretty rare. The corals are sensitive creatures and do seem to have a negative reaction to a vast majority of water contaminants when the concentration gets high enough. Then probably the biggest pool, generally safe impurities or contaminants that follow the water over time, but limited to no visible negative impacts at low to reasonable levels. Many of these contaminants are inevitable additions to the tank through food, water, and additives. Some common examples of generally safe are nitrate, phosphate, silica, but the chances of issues scale up rapidly as the water becomes more polluted with them. There are also elements like zinc, lithium, iron, and even copper, which have beneficial roles at the right levels, but will become straight up poisons when they build up over time with continual input and no matching export. I believe this type of prolonged microdose of generally safe contaminants are by far the most common direct cause of reaching toxic levels or slowly stressing or poisoning the tank. Time to dive right into the most common sources, or what the inputs are, some of the things that we add to the tank every single day. Number one is a type of contaminants from freshwater additions to replace evaporation. We all know RODI, and a quality source of freshwater is a core component of most of our approaches to reefing. However, very few people know what we're actually trying to remove from our city or well water, so it doesn't go into the tank. Reality is our tap water is designed to be safe to drink. No one ever considered if it should be safe for corals. For instance, copper pite's common in many homes. We'd never use that on a tank. We put disinfectant like chlorine into the water to make it safe to drink, which rapidly kills fish and coral. Honestly, chlorine and chloramines are also not good for us either, but the disinfectants are just better than spreading the plague, so we use it. But even then, many of us filter that back out with carbon or drinking water RO systems. Just to give you an idea of what's in the water, this is an ICP report of my own home's well water. I don't have disinfectant because it's well water, but I do have super high levels of calcium and bicarbonate, which would mess up my salt mix levels for sure. Calcium would be 100 points high if I used my water unfiltered. Barium, nitrate, very high silica, arsenic, chromium, as well as iron and sulfate bacteria are also present. Most of this actually at what's considered safe levels for drinking, where the human body filters out and eliminates many contaminants from our bodies, but daily additions of arsenic, chromium, barium on a reef tank, which doesn't have an immediate export method, is a complete unknown. This ICP test is actually only a partial look at what's in my well water. There's almost certainly other undesirable elements in there as well. Admittedly, my home's 577 TDS well water is terrible, but just 3 miles from there is Minneapolis city water at the BRS warehouse, which is often less than 100 TDS and may appear clean. In one of our investigates, we tested the BRS warehouse Minneapolis water with 2.5 parts per million nitrate, 0.5 phosphate, 11 parts per million silica, 3 parts per million chlorine, and near a full part per million ammonia. So while the TDS is low, just looking at these few things, 20% of it is what we don't want to dose to the tank daily, and we haven't even touched the other 100 things that we could test for, so lower TDS doesn't always mean better. These totally different water challenges just a few miles from each other are representative of why RODI is the nationwide proactive solution to preventing the addition and accumulation of a wide range of pollutants in our tanks. Not that every last reefer needs to use RODI to be successful, only that a vast majority of water sources contain many undesirable daily inputs to the tank. In the end, I think it's clear to see why a vast majority of reef tanks benefit from eliminating freshwater as a daily source of perpetually building pollutants. The next daily input of pollutants is fish and coral foods. Most of us understand that putting food in will result in the addition of nitrogen and phosphorus to the tank. At low levels, not a big concern, but at higher levels, nitrate and phosphate inhibit calcification, slow coral growth, promote algae and pest organism growth, at some point widely believed to be a stressor or irritant to both fish and coral. Well, the safe level of these contaminants is heavily debated. Nearly every long-term successful tank that I've come across has some method of making sure there isn't perpetually rising nitrate and phosphate polluting the water, filter socks, pad or felt rolls, and protein skimmers being the primary methods. These should be the core methods because they actually go after the actual food and fish waste before it breaks down. Solutions like carbon dosing and scrubbers and refugiums are good solutions for removing nitrate and phosphate after the food is broken down. Exporting the food and fish waste before it breaks down to nitrate and phosphate has two benefits. First, that means you remove the pollutants before they had a chance to feed those undesirable algae and pest organisms in the tank. But more poignant to today's topic, fish food is obviously not just nitrogen and phosphorus. Take a look at this Hikari fish food. It has fish meal, wheat flour, cuttlefish meal, dried seaweed meal, clam extract, marigold flour. So anything that's bound up in these organisms' tissue is actually going to the tank, and that's not just nitrogen and phosphorus, but all kinds of elements found in that organism's tissue. On top of that, these foods commonly also have additives like riboflavin, vitamin A, zinc sulfate, and copper sulfate. So accumulation of nitrate and phosphate is not the only consideration from the input of food, and it's not that any of that stuff is bad. In fact, a well-rounded, complete source of nutrition is ideal for the fish and many corals. It's just another area where what goes in needs to come out, and thought put into that will realize long-term results. Getting it before it completely breaks down with filter socks, pad, felt, and skimmers are the frontline best option because it gets nearly everything. After it completely breaks down, it will require multiple approaches. It's going to sound strange here because nearly everyone has one, but I believe protein skimmers are likely one of the most underutilized filters on our tanks, meaning there's overwhelming room for performance improvement by sizing, matching, placing, and tuning a skimmer for way better performance. If your skimmer's oversized and just looks like a boiling pot of water but rarely produces much, or undersized and works but also produces very little, this is you. Many people could likely get 3 times the performance just by better understanding how they work, and why you'll see a Master Your Protein Skimmer episode in the near future. But a wide array of pollution input from foods, or why water changes that effectively dilute these additions over time, are also an effective solution. In fact, I think you're going to see a theme here, how water changes end up being the catch-all for preventing or slowing the accumulation of nearly every pollutant we put in the tank. Another way food inputs pollute the tank is they break down into yellow color pigments. We performed an experiment a while back where the yellow water in one of our tanks reduced the PAR by over 30%. Meaning if you thought you had 300 PAR, it might actually only be 200 now. That's because the yellow color pigments in the water rapidly absorb blue light entering the tank. Not only does this type of pollutant reduce PAR, but changes the visual color of the tank and fluorescence of the corals as well. Luckily, a couple bucks of activated carbon will eliminate the accumulation of color pigment contaminants from the tank, and probably the easiest thing to solve. In fact, I'll go as far to say if you're not using carbon, at least periodically, your water's likely pretty yellow. You may just not know it because that's compensated for with so much blue light, but turn off all the lights and look through the long end of the tank, and it should be easy to see. It's either crystal clear or it's a yellow tint. The most compelling results done in a water change where you can compare the old water with the new water in a pair of white buckets. To see it best, they do need to be white, and the depth of the 5-gallon bucket simulates the depth of many display tanks. Another daily input of pollutants are additives like 1 parts, 2 parts, and even calcium reactors. There are 3 factors here at play: inherent chemistry issues, an overdose risk of related balance, major, minor, and trace elements, and to some degree, impurities. The most significant inherent chemistry issue is with 2 parts. 2 parts meaning anything where the calcium and alkalinity are in separate parts, but can be as many as 7 parts. They all use calcium chloride for 1 part, and the other a sodium-based alkalinity additive. Net result of that approach is that corals consume the calcium and alkalinity and then leave the sodium and chloride behind in the water, essentially polluting the tank with excess salt or sodium chloride. I don't think that this is the kind of thing that most people consider as a pollutant, but if you do nothing about it, it might take a year or so, but steadily increasing salinity from excess sodium chloride is absolutely toxic at some point and a component of poor water chemistry. Most 2 parts solve this with dilution through water changes, elevated salinity only becoming an issue in the highest consumption or most neglected of tanks. But this is something to strongly consider if your system receives very few water changes. There are a couple 2-part systems out there that directly address the salinity issue with Triton and Tropic Marine's balling method. And in the spirit of mastering 2-part, we will have a related episode that dives deep into how all the approaches to 2-part work as well. One of the things that most reefers do not consider as a potential source of pollutants is the approach to minor and trace elements each brand of additives has. So zinc, iron, and iodine is not a contaminant, it's intentionally added. However, it adds more than your tank consumes in a day and builds up, eventually it does become a pollutant. Historically, this is where a good water change schedule is the simplest, and because of that, I believe the most effective solution to mitigating both toxic under and overdosing. In today's era of reefing, you can actually get a more direct window into this with ICP testing, and with practice, you will almost certainly identify the imbalances from your particular additive solution. However, even if you do find the cause with ICP, for most of the elements which have risen to levels that we would consider them as pollutants in the tank's chemistry, the solution is still a series of water changes to get them down. So proactive versus reactive, a simple weekly 10% water change being the simplest solution and often the most effective as well. The third source of additive-related pollutants is actually impurities in the source materials. All of these additives are produced from various sources of raw materials, often mined or evaporated. Probably easiest to understand with calcium reactor media, which is not just calcium carbonate, but everything in the calcium carbonate stone or skeletal structure of the coral it came from. Most notably, most of these calcium reactor medias absolutely add some amount of phosphate. Probably wise to measure the tank and the reactor's effluent to get an idea of that relationship, and if you need to export method like GFO to address that. However, with chemical additives, sometimes this is actually something that you can see with the naked eye, with some mixing up visually brown. If you can see it with the naked eye, it's not a trace element and absolutely should be considered a pollutant of some type. However, if it's a widely used additive used by thousands of tanks for many years, it's likely not in that category of poison where a single dose diluted in your entire tank is going to harm anything. The only real question at that point is the pollutant totally inert and regardless of the concentration will never be harmful, or is it just generally safe, and as long as we're good about other export methods like water changes, likely won't be an issue. Doing an ICP test a few times a year might be the best answer for your specific tank and choice of additives, but I can tell you these additives are absolutely not all the same. We did an ICP MS series a while back where we sent out 6 different samples of 5 different additives at the cost of about 20 grand, and I believe the net result of that conversation is you can chase numbers with ICP and try to understand or guess at the effects of impurities, or you can just use a high-grade product to begin with, and they often don't even cost more. External quality assurances like pharmaceutical grade materials being the most reliable standard that I've come across. For example, the BRS Pharma Kalkwasser having 0 aluminum versus hundreds of parts per million and all the rest, half the copper, 40 times lower heavy metals, 0 phosphate rather than 40 to 50 parts per million, and 22 silica rather than in the thousands. In general, I found that any brand that clearly states the grade of material they use or maintains a public standard tends to dramatically outperform the rest. Something that we've seen in salt mix experiments as well. However, this is one of those areas where all of these additives, pollutants included, will likely produce initial results and generally safe. And why sometimes reefers just don't care how dirty brown it is or documented impurities because it doesn't seem to have harmed the tank. This is where you have to decide for yourself is this a case where it's truly inert and a non-issue, or is this where 300 generally safe doses may eventually accumulate to the same addition as a single very toxic or poisonous dose, which is just as much about the quality of the additive as it is about your unique approach to export. What goes in has to come out. The story here continues. This is again where a good water change or dilution schedule benefits the tank in ways that you may not have appreciated prior. But note that if the water change begins to slip, what was a very effective pollutant control strategy may no longer work, and the signs of that may take months to show up. If you run into these issues, look for that causation and act. So all that said, my personal recommendation for an additive system is the simplest approaches with the most supporting science, quality source materials, and long-standing results in the industry are the top solutions. BRS 2-part with water changes being the most affordable and difficult to mess up, Tropic Marin's balling method a more advanced but straightforward approach, and Triton combined with ICP testing, the final frontier of 2-parts where the mentality or approach is confirmed with testing, but it comes at a significant cost. Another daily addition of pollutants is something very few of us think about, but it's in the surrounding air and gas exchange. There are a few very common sources. First, obviously, avoid spraying aerosols near the tank, like disinfectant, air fresheners, and glass cleaners. All of these are very clearly undesirable pollutants. Even an air freshener in the room is a bad idea. Less common, many people run their skimmer lines outside for fresh air and solving pH challenges. However, they forget someone occasionally sprays herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers near that. Or it might be near car pollution or even a laundry dryer port. Your skimmer provides a vast majority of the gas exchange with most tanks, so really put some thought into where it pulls air from if you're going to port it outside. Another air-based pollutant or toxin in the tank is excess carbon dioxide or CO2. High CO2 in the house from people and pets breathing and low gas exchange in the room is the #1 cause of low pH in otherwise well cared for tanks. The high CO2 and related low pH is a poisonous chemistry of the corals, limits calcification, makes it much harder for the coral to maintain its own internal pH. In this case, open up some windows, use your air exchanger, or get some more plants into the room. However, if you have serious issues keeping your pH above 7.8, you can use a CO2 scrubber and media to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide or this air-based pollutant that's injected into the tank via your skimmer. You might not have thought about it this way, but if you have chronically low pH, the CO2 scrubber is filtering out a pollutant, the CO2 that deteriorates water chemistry and is harmful to the tank. Next is a group of less frequently added pollutants, starting with salt mix. This one seems kind of ironic because the water change is supposed to be removing pollutants, but it can actually be a source as well. Like anything in this world, there are some better options than others, some significantly so. Many of us have seen the pollutants on ICP reports, as well as visual brown crud and film in freshly mixed saltwater. However, with salt mixes, rather than making daily addition to the tank, you're removing some and then replacing it with new water. This swap doesn't have the same accumulative effect as additives, and to some degree, not as concerning. No one really knows what that brown material is in the salt mix. Some people believe it's a clay designed to capture impurities in the salt mix or provide anti-caking properties. But I believe, because I see it in the raw materials like calcium and alkalinity additives, it's very likely impurities in the lower grade or cost raw materials, especially because you don't see that gunk in salt mixes that use clearly stated higher grade materials. That said, I don't believe salt mix impurities from widely used salts are likely to harm the tank, but that's just a general statement and assumes that you do clean the bin periodically and never stir it up or dose a concentrated amount of that brown stuff to the tank. That said, if you gave me, or really anyone, a cup of that concentrated brown material, I'd never let you put it in my tank, so my DNA is really saying try and avoid it if possible. Using a pump and sediment filter is proving to be a very effective manner of visually eliminating many of these impurities. ICP would be the only way of knowing its effect on the actual elements, but my guess is minimal. If ICP comes back clear, I'd consider the simple sediment filter a solid solution for not just removing contaminants, but also keeping my salt mixing bin and equipment clean. That said, if you're willing to shell out an extra $5 to $10 a month, pharmaceutical grade salts like Tropic Marin's entire line don't have the same impurities in the source materials. Mix clean right off the bat, and what I personally use. In the end, if water changes are going to be a primary component of so many elements of my pollution control, I just want to be confident in that water that I'm using to do that with. There's another group of common pollutants. Those are what I'd call the unintended pollutants, meaning your hands, kids' hands, or stuff they drop in the tank, broken gear like exploded pumps or heaters, and surprise drips off of copper pipes in the ceiling. There are 101 causes for something like this. In this case, there are too many small one-offs to cover, but running activated carbon is a proactive or protective solution to many of them. Activated carbon will remove all kinds of chemicals from the tank, and probably the most effective and lowest cost general contaminant filter. Periodic ICP tests often solving ongoing issues like an unseen drip of a copper pipe and slowly deteriorating broken pump or pennies or kids might have dropped in the tank. If there's an immediate issue, there are medias like Brightwell's Purate, which is a carbon mixed with resin that removes copper, lead, and other heavy metals. I've seen tanks that were rapidly deteriorating, losing massive amounts of corals, do a complete turnaround after using Purate. This is the kind of thing that's wise to have on hand, or at least be aware of so you can overnight it as needed, or even pester your local fish store into bringing it in so it's available when you need it. Outside of that, large water changes are the best solution for immediately toxic or suspected poisons in the tank. When I do a 50% water change, I know I remove 50% of the problem. If it rises back up, I can go hunting for pennies in the tank. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a tank rapidly going south, but a single 50% water change stops it in its tracks, or 3 or 4 30% water changes over days eliminates the issue altogether. Most of the time, I'll never know what was in the tank or where it came from, but removing the water and replacing it works. So all that sounds like a lot to think about, but how hard that is depends on the approach, and it can be very easy. Nearly all of us start off the hobby by playing cat and mouse with water chemistry, trying to catch and fix or save things in a very reactive approach. In fact, to some degree, I think I did this for the first decade of reefing, largely believing things were good until corals or fish were visibly showing signs of deteriorating health, and then solving. That's a nice way of saying it. In reality, the corals and fish were effectively being poisoned by the buildup of pollutants and deteriorating water quality or chemistry, and then I was fixing it when they're visibly sick. It's kind of embarrassing to say that out loud, but it's real, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Acknowledging that is how we solve it for ourselves and future reefers. There have been times when that catch and solve approach to reefing was more effective than others. First, we all get better at recognizing the signs and solutions over many years. With larger tanks, the pollutants build up slower and the fixes last longer. And with multi-year established tanks filled with corals wall to wall, they distribute or dilute the biological uptake of many contaminants, particularly the buildup of nitrate and phosphate, but also distributing some of the more toxic elements over a larger number of corals. Those three things combined are probably why you see some of those larger 5 to 10 year bulletproof tanks that seem to thrive with very minimal effort. But this is a journey with a destination, not a starting point we should be recommending to those in those first few years. However, there's one thing I found to be near universally true, not just from my own experiences, but one super common thread between nearly every long-term reefer I know. The tank does awesome, rarely runs into issues, and has the fewest mortalities when they're good about the maintenance. And that success often slowly deteriorates during the periods where the success lulls us into a sense of confidence that we can skip or put some things off that got us to that point. Just an ebb and flow of water quality and related results. At this point, it's probably very apparent why that reactive approach of catch and then solve produces nearly inevitable paths, both good and bad, but more so why a proactive approach of understanding what goes in the tank must come out, and doing that as part of good maintenance is a jump in the learning curve, and you can avoid all kinds of challenges that reefers before you have experienced. More so, you can skip all those hard lessons if you want. Getting export right requires understanding the inputs to the tank that we discussed already, daily food additions, sources of fresh water, air surrounding the tank and home, additive choices, salt mix, our hands, and so on. However, rather than reacting to these when they present issues, acknowledge they exist and prevent them proactively. These challenges are not just predictable, but also avoidable. More importantly, it should now be clear why an ounce of prevention will not just be a pound of cure in terms of effort in solving the common issues, but also cost. It's dramatically cheaper when you can avoid the cure costs and all the mortalities. The ounce of prevention in this case is RDI as freshwater source, high purity salt mix, simple clean additive system, a small amount of activated carbon for unintended chemicals, a skimmer and filter socks, but most importantly, that universal equalizer, a good water change schedule neutralizing bad decisions, bad luck, and even less than perfect filtration. So this is today's big question. Was this just a 20-minute plus video to tell you why you should do the things that you're already doing? Or are you now closer to mastering chemistry with a deeper understanding of why it's done this way, some areas to improve, increased ability to troubleshoot, and a renewed commitment to keep doing the things that are working? Keeping on that path, it's time to master the next phase of chemistry, major, minor, and trace elements. All of our Master Your Tank series found here on our BRStv channel page, with this entire series diving deeper than we ever have before and creating what we hope to be the best reefing resource out there, all on one page.